Hey, and welcome to video 2 for week 9. So what we're going to be taking a look at in this video is, now that we've learnt a few new effects, we're going to learn a couple of other things about Ableton, which we've very briefly covered, but I haven't actually explained what they are, and just some other techniques that we can use, especially for the mixdown stage. But these techniques will be handy for you throughout your production as well. So what we're going to cover in this video is learning about sends and returns, and then quickly covering some of the other controls that we have down here. Well, let's take a look at sends and returns to start off with. So if we look in the session view here, on each track, we have these two sends here, and then we have these two tracks that are over on the far right here, A reverb and B delay. If you can't see these sends down here, make sure you have this on, so this little S here, which shows the sends. Once you have that on and you can see your sends, we're ready to get started. So if we have a look at the returns, I'll just double click this one. Here we have a reverb. This one's called A reverb, this one's delay. So we've got a delay on this one, and we have a reverb on this one. So how do these work? Basically, the way that sends and returns work is that instead of putting a reverb on the track itself, let's say like this, let me just show you the loop first. So I just got a little drum loop up here. Now let's say I wanted some reverb on these drums. I could just throw a reverb on it like this, and then, start playing around with it till I get something I want. But another way we can do that is actually by using a return. So here we have a reverb return, and it's already set up for us with the dry wet up to 100 and the decay times all set. So if we wanted to start to get some reverb on these drums, we could just send this track to this reverb return. So A corresponds to obviously A, and then B for B, and you can add more returns in as well, and then you'll start to get more knobs down here. So now we have C. Let me just show you the first one first. So I'm going to start sending this track to A reverb. Okay, so now I have reverb on my drums, and I haven't actually got any reverb audio effects on the drums themselves. So what's happening is I'm actually routing this track to another track which has a reverb on it, being our return, and then that's going to the master channel. So over here we have B delay. So let me get rid of the reverb. Let's say I wanted some delay on these drums. I can now start sending these drums to the B return. Okay, so it's a pretty handy way to get some quick effects without actually throwing the effects onto the tracks themselves. So the way that the effects sound are going to be determined by how they're set up on the actual returns. So here I have 3/16. So if I wanted to change the timing of the delay, I could do that. Okay, so I could mess around with that, and the same goes for the reverb. If I didn't like the decay time, I could start sending it to the reverb, and then I could mess with this. So we can edit the way that these returns sound by tweaking them on the actual return tracks themselves. So why is this handy? Let's say we had some other sounds. So I'm going to chuck some other sounds in now. Okay, I've just gone in and I've added a few more tracks, so it's starting to sound like an actual finished piece of music. So if we listen to all these together, we have vocals, we've got keys, we've got percussion, we've got some chords and drums. So we've got the whole works going on really. So we have 5 tracks here. Typically, if you're making a finished song, you're going to have a lot more tracks than this, as you can see with the track that I'm actually making week by week since the beginning. That's above 10 to 12 now, I think, off memory. But it can go much higher than that, so you can end up with 40 to 50 tracks if you're not careful. Now, if we wanted reverb on these sounds, we know that we can just throw reverb on the tracks. So if I want reverb on the drums, I can solo this, tweak the reverb, get something I like. Then if I figure out that, let's say these vocals need some more reverb, I can do that. And I can mess around with this. So I get what I want. Now if I keep going through this process, let's say I need some delay on the vocals, the keys need delay, they need reverb. Once you start to have a few more tracks, it can really add up. So before you know it, you have 30 to 40 tracks and they all have reverb and delay audio effects on them. It's not going to be so bad if you're on a very powerful modern computer where you can handle all those tracks and it just doesn't matter. But for a lot of us, it's really going to start to add up and put a lot of pressure on the CPU and the computer itself. So instead of having to process each track separately with reverb and delay, because we have a reverb and delay here, we can just start sending these tracks to those returns to get the effect that we're after. And we haven't actually added any more audio effects or plugins onto the tracks themselves. So if these drums need a bit more reverb, I can send it to that return. Those vocals, I feel like they need more reverb, I'll push this to the return as well. Let me just bump this up to say 2.5 seconds. Okay, so I can send the vocal to that return as well, get some reverb on it. And then let's say these keys need reverb and delay as well. Send these. Mess around with this. And then if the percussion needed some as well, I can do this. So now that percussion has reverb and delay on it. Okay, so now all these tracks, well not all of them, but most of them, let's put some delay on this one, or maybe just a bit of reverb. I'm just doing this for example, by the way. I don't need to add reverb and delay for every single track. It's just to give you an example of how this works. So now that we've got reverb or delay on all of these tracks, we've only used sends and returns. So we haven't actually added any more instances of the reverb and delay audio effect or plugin. There's literally just one reverb and one delay, and all these tracks are getting piped into the reverb and then going to the master channel, and same with the delay. So this is a really handy way that we can add effects to multiple tracks without actually inserting more plugins onto the tracks themselves, because that can get quite messy. And then it can also start to slow your computer down. And the other reason we want to use sends and returns is because if at the end we want to go back to our dry signals for all of the sounds that we've created, whether it be for mixing purposes, mastering purposes, whatever it might be, that way we still have our dry signals here. But once we export these, we export the reverb and delay separately. That way it can be processed on its own. And you still have the dry signals doing their thing. So it's a good way to keep your processing separate, not only for CPU usage and to just clean things up in your project, but also to make it easier for the mixdown stage later on. Once you export the tracks separately to do a mixdown, if you decide to do that, you can tone down the processing itself without actually affecting the original sounds. So the reverb and delay won't be baked into these tracks. They'll be separate. Now, one question you might have is, what if you want a different reverb for different tracks? Because there's no real one size fits all when it comes to reverb and delay. You're probably going to want to have different sized reverbs, different decays for different types of sounds, and same goes for delay. Not everything is going to want to be delayed by 2/16 like we got here. So the way that we can start to customize this is to add more returns. So I can insert another return track by right-clicking up here, or I can go Command, Option, and T, or Command, Alt, and T, and that will insert another return. Once I have my return up here, I can put any audio effect onto it. Let's go with another reverb. And let's say we want a longer decay this time. So something like 5 seconds. I'll put 5 seconds. With your return tracks, make sure your effects are set to 100%. That's one thing you have to be aware of. Any effects that you throw on your returns, make sure you set them to 100% because you don't want to get more dry signal being exported out of the return. You want the return to just export the wet reverbed version because we've already got our dry signals over here. So make sure your effects are set to 100% in the returns. And the way that you dial the dry wet is through the actual send itself. Now I've got A, B, and C. So you can rename these as well. I'm going to rename this, and I suggest you do this if you make more returns. I'm renaming this long reverb. Let me just fix up reverb. I'm just going to add another one onto the end here with, make sure this is at 100%, dry wet, and I'm going to make this a little bit shorter. So yeah, maybe 1.2 seconds or 1 second. Somewhere around there. So now I have 3 reverb returns. So I've got my mid reverb, the original one, which is 2.5 seconds. I have a long reverb, which is 5 seconds. And then I have a short reverb, which is just over a second long. Now that I've created these different sized reverbs, I have a lot more flexibility with my sounds as to what reverb I want on each sound. So if we take a look at my drums, let's dial down this send. Now they're just the original dry version. Let's say I wanted a really short and snappy reverb because they are drums. I can use this one here, which I've renamed my short verb. And we know that this is return D. So that if we want this reverb here, we have to use the D send, which is down here. Now I'll start to get a nice short reverb. And we can dial in how much of this reverb we want with this send here. So if you want to completely send the whole thing to that reverb, we would do that. Let's say I'm happy with something like that. The drums. Let's get rid of this send on this vocal. Now I might want a really long reverb on these vocals, so we know that our long return reverb is over here on C. So I can send this vocal to C, and we'll start getting that reverb. And again, depends how much I want, and I can dial this up and down. Cool, so we can start doing the same for all of our sounds now. So let's say our keys. Might want a mid reverb on these. Then our percussion. Maybe the short verb again. Go quite harsh with it. We can leave the chords there on the mid reverb. So now all these sounds have different sized reverbs depending on what sound, and we've done different amounts depending on how much reverb we wanted on each track. Yet we've still only used 3 reverbs. So we can have, 30 to 40 tracks in here, and because we've got these different sized reverbs set up, we can just keep sending them to those returns without actually adding more instances of the reverb or whatever other audio effect itself. And you can do exactly the same thing for the delay. So if we want different delays, I can add another one in here. And you'll see what I did just there. Because I wanted the delay next to this one, I selected this one here, inserted a new delay here. Because I've done that, I've now offset the letters. So if I delete this, so we've got, let's say we got C for the long reverb. If I insert another return here, that turns to D. But Ableton remembers what the letters were, so it's not going to mess up what you've done with the sends already, as you can see here. If I delete this, so the short reverb is on D, these two here. If I insert a return here, the short reverb is now E, but Ableton has automatically shifted that to E for us. So it's not going to mess it all up and think that this is still D or anything like that. So I'm going to put another delay on this, make it much quicker, make sure the dry wet is 100%, and let's add a little more feedback as well. So these keys, well, let's just do it with the vocals. Okay, so now we've got different delays. This one's doing 1/16, and this one's doing 1/8 notes. And then we can dial those different delays in depending on what we want. So I've only been showing you reverb and delays for the returns because those are the typical types of returns that you would have. You can insert any audio effect onto these returns and use them as a send and return. So let's get rid of this delay here. Let's say we want a saturator. So we can actually throw a saturator on, make sure the dry wet's 100%, and let's make it quite harsh, something like that. Now if I start sending these vocals to the saturator, make sure I actually turn my drive up as well. Let's say, yeah, let's drive it up like that, and then bring this back down. Okay, you can see we're getting saturation now, but we haven't actually added a saturator onto the vocals themselves. And then we can add some saturation to the drums as well. So you can literally, I'm just showing you because you can do this with any effect. If you wish to have something on the return, we can take our chorus here, set this to 100%, and now we've got a chorus on C. So if I take these keys here, I'm adding chorus to those keys without actually putting it on here. And I can do that to the vocals as well. So I hope that all makes sense to you. It is really handy to use. Now, just because I'm showing you how powerful sends and returns are doesn't mean I never want you to put audio effects on the tracks themselves. Again, I still use a lot of effects on the tracks themselves, especially, you know, even reverb and delay like we've been using on the returns, just because I can really get a customized feel and sound for each individual track. Like for the drums, I might want something a little brighter with a very specific decay time. Instead of just sending it to a return. So I guess the takeaway that I want you to get from this is do use returns when you can. If you're after a very specific sound, don't feel bad to throw the effects actually just straight on there like this. So if we wanted to hear what was coming out of the returns, let's say we take a look at this mid reverb. So return A, we've got the chords and the keys going into that. We can actually listen to what the process signal sounds like that's coming out and going into the master channel just by soloing the return. So we can hear that that's what's being added on top of the dry signals. If we take a look at our chorus, we can hear the vocals and those keys and a little bit of those drums. So whatever you solo on here on these returns, you're just going to hear the processed wet version. You're not going to hear any of the dry signal. Okay, so I'm just going to delete these now. Feel free to start using these whenever you want, especially on your own tracks if you're starting to build up quite a few different sounds and whatnot, you can begin to use returns so that you can clean up your tracks a little bit and you don't have, 10, 15 effects down here on each individual track. Especially if you find yourself using the same reverb or same delay over and over again, use a return instead of actually just copying and pasting the same effects onto each individual track. Okay, so that's sends and returns. We're going to stay down here and take a look at a couple more things. So I think I covered early on in this course what this was, but this is a way that we can pan our sounds left and right. So as I begin to pan this more right, see we're getting more signal on the right ear than the left. I'll push it all the way to the left. Now we're only getting it on the left signal. And this can be handy if we want to, I guess, push things out into space a little bit more so not everything's centered. Let's say we got our chords here. We can put our chords so that they're a little more in the left ear. You've probably heard this in songs before, but you might not have noticed. Where you had, let's say, chords in the left ear and then a lead in the right. Or maybe you had different sets of vocalists in the right and left ear. So this is how we can start to get that effect. So I'm going to push the chords over to the left a little bit more. So if we just solo them, not all the way, something like that. There's still a little bit coming through the right ear. And then I'm going to take these keys and do the opposite. So now the keys are in the right ear and the chords are in the left. Play these together. You're still getting all that information through, but because we've pushed them to each side now a little bit, it sounds a lot more interesting to us because we have different things going on in each ear. The same with this percussion here. I can push this off to one side. And then if I had, say, another set of hi-hats or whatever, I could counter that and push those to the left, and that would give us a cool effect. I'll actually do that now, just quickly. I'll bring in some hats. Okay, I've just added some hats in so we can see what this sounds like. So it's percussion going in the right ear, a little more than the left. And now I'm going to solo these and push these over to the left. So if we listen to them together, that's giving us another cool effect. So if we listen to it all together now, it's going to sound quite interesting because we've got all these different things going on separately in each ear. Okay. So that's what these big controls are in the middle of each track. At the bottom here is the panning. If we make our way over here again, and we hit this little D, now we get our track delays that pop up on the bottom here. Sorry, I should have mentioned as well, with the returns, if you can't see them, it's because this R is off. Make sure you got that on. So S for sends, R for returns. I usually just like to have them all on, unless I really need the real estate, and then I'll start to close things off. But to turn on our delays, we hit this little D here. So what this track delay allows us to do down here is it allows us to shift the entire track forward or back in time without actually changing any notes or MIDI patterns, without moving the audio file, without moving the audio clip. We're not changing any of that. We literally just take the entire track and move it forward or backward in time, depending on what we have set down here. So it's set in milliseconds. Let's say with these hats, I wanted to make them a bit lazy. That's a term I like to use. It's just you make them a little later than on the beat. That way it gives them that little bit of groove and that laziness. So if I play this together with the drums, I'll start to delay this track and you'll hear them start to be offset in time. So as I drag this down, the hats are actually starting before the drums now by 159 milliseconds. If I double click it to return it to 0, now they're on the beat, and then I can make them lazy by pushing them up. Now when you're using this, do be subtle with it, because it's going to change. Obviously it's going to affect your whole track, and it doesn't matter what your note's doing, it'll shift the whole thing forward or backwards. If I want them really lazy, I could push this up. If you go too far, you can really start to mess up the timing. And you can hear if I push it up, let's say half a second, so 500 milliseconds, it takes that long for them to actually hit at the start. So I'll pause it, and I'll play. So now they're really offset. But when I'm using this, I like to just be very subtle with it. So, you know, anything under 50-ish. And it just adds that little bit of character and offset to your track, so not everything's hitting perfectly on time. You can do this with MIDI clips by actually drawing the notes not perfectly on the beat. So it's the same thing like that. But this just makes it a lot easier to affect the whole track at once. Instead of drawing each note and offsetting it or moving your audio clips, we can just use this track delay down here to offset the entire thing forwards or backwards. That's what this little D does. So we can show and hide this whole section here by turning on and off this mixer. And then if you can't see your audio froms or audio twos, that would be your in and outs over here. So you can also show and hide that. But that pretty much sums it up for this video. I just wanted to show you what these actually were, because you might have seen them, been wondering how to use them. Now we know that we can just send our tracks to our returns and we'll get those effects that are on here. But like I mentioned, just because I'm showing you this now doesn't mean you have to change your entire track and system to suit this. You can still throw your effects onto the tracks themselves. And I do it all the time. But if you do find yourself using the same reverbs or the same audio effects over and over again, just use a return. That way you can clean your track up a little bit. You don't have as many instances of it. And then when it comes to the final stage of exporting, you can have your processed sound separately to the dry versions. Yeah, make use of the returns, and you can make as many of these as you need if you have different sized reverbs, different delays, any other audio effects that you want to use. You can just throw them on there and start channeling your tracks into them. So that's it for this video. I was going to cover grouping in here, but I'm going to do that in the next video once we actually start doing a mix down on our own tracks. So I'm going to take everything that we've been learning and we're going to start applying it to our own songs. Feel free to mess around with these before you jump into the next video if you want to start playing around with the returns and sends. So if you want to do some cleanup, go ahead and do that. Otherwise, I'll see you in video 3 where we'll start mixing down our tracks.